Hello and welcome to today's web seminar, How Microsoft Releases at the Speed of Mobile, sponsored by testlio and featuring Crystal Krustuk, co-founder and CEO at testlio, and Kevin Henriksen, Partner Director of Engineering at Microsoft. I'm your host and moderator, Josiah Renaudin. Thank you for joining us today. Before I hand it over to the speakers, let me explain the controls on this console. If you experience any technical issues, please send a note through the question field located beneath the panels, and we'll be on hand to help as quickly as possible. Our responses can be read in the Q&A panel to the left of the slides. There's also the same way to submit questions. We welcome all comments and inquiries during today's event, so feel free to ask as many as you'd like, and we'll answer as many as possible during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. This event contains polling questions, which can be answered within the slide view. To optimize your bandwidth for the best viewing experience possible, please be sure to close out any unnecessary applications that may be running in the background. At the bottom of your console is a widget toolbar. These widgets open panels. The console opens with 3 on your screen: the speaker, Q&A, and the slide panels. All of these panels can be moved around and resized to your liking. If you accidentally close one, click the respective widget to reopen the panel in its original place. Hover your cursor over these icons to reveal labels identifying each widget. Through these icons, you can download the speaker slides and white papers, as well as share this event with friends and colleagues. This event is being recorded and made available for on-demand viewing. Once the recording is ready, you'll receive an email with instructions on how to access the presentation and slides on demand. With that said, I'd like to introduce and pass controls to our first speaker, Crystal.
Thank you so much, Josiah, for this amazing introduction. We are super excited to have you, all of us, join us today. I am joining you from this incredible Tallinn, Estonia today, and Kevin is joining us from San Francisco. So we're very happy to have Kevin here with us today. And today we have a very cool topic. So we're going to talk about how Microsoft releases at the speed of mobile. And as we all know, mobile is a very challenging space. It's very competitive, and you really have to have a good quality product to make your customers happy. And therefore, I have invited Kevin, who's an absolute industry veteran with a lot of experience to talk about this topic. A little bit about myself as well. Let me change the slide as well. My name is Crystal, and I am the CEO of testlio. And I started testlio 4.5 years ago, and the entire idea of testlio was actually born out of my frustration as a tester for different crowdsourced testing platforms. So what testlio essentially does is we have a global community of expert software testers to provide amazing customer experience for our customers. And the entire idea, as I said, was born out of my frustration for different crowdsourced testing platforms. And some of the bigger issues for me was that testers' time wasn't really appreciated, and on the other hand, the testers were always competing with each other, and therefore I saw the opportunity that the testers are not actually being used for their capabilities, and testing was always thought about as an afterthought. So I decided to change that, and therefore, over the past 4.5 years, we've had this incredible experience of working with some of the top brands in the world. And today, I'm super happy to have Kevin Henriksen here to join me. And I'm going to give a brief introduction about Kevin as well, but I'm looking forward to talking about himself as well. But Kevin is a partner director of engineering at Outlook Mobile. And before he joined the Outlook team, he was actually the founder of a company called Accompli. And after 18 months of development, they were acquired by Microsoft, and Accompli turned to Outlook. And therefore, it's a very interesting story. And I would love to now introduce Kevin. And Kevin, maybe you can share a couple of things about yourself, like what brought you into this space, and what does your role entitle at Microsoft?
Sure. Thanks, Crystal. First of all, thanks for having me. Excited to be here and chat with you guys for the next hour or so. So as you said, yeah, previously to Microsoft, I was a co-founder of a company called Accompli, which Microsoft acquired and then renamed. It was a mobile application for email and calendar. and they renamed it to Outlook. And so for the last couple years, we've been building out and continuing to innovate around email, mobile email particularly, under the Outlook brand. Today I run the engineering teams for kind of all the non-Windows Outlook clients, so iOS, Android, and Mac. Let's see, previous to that, I've been doing email for like 16 years, and so a long time. Working with a company called OpenWave doing carrier email, and then Zimbra, which is like an enterprise kind of Web 2.0 email company, and now most recently Acompli, and then finally now doing it kind of with the biggest email company in the world by some measures with Microsoft.
Thank you for the introduction. It's like, as I said already, we're very excited to have you here. And I think with Acompli especially, like we can start talking about like the difference between delivering the product to consumers and then to the enterprise customers, which definitely Outlook has a lot today, right? But beforehand, maybe I can go over like our today's agenda real quick as well. So we're going to talk about testing at Microsoft. We are going to talk about the state of mobile and especially like the challenges that the mobile space is currently facing. We're going to talk about this famous topic like releasing at speed and how to do it in good quality, which I think Kevin has done amazingly well. And we're going to end up with how we're measuring success of QA and the entire organization and what's the future of testing. So I'm really excited to start this topic off with testing at Microsoft. So Kevin, my first question to you would be, how does your team really think about QA at Microsoft?
Yeah, great question. I think so. Microsoft, just before we were acquired, had moved to something they called combined engineering, which meant in practice they eliminated the role of tester. And so the testing organizations were collapsed into engineering, and the kind of combined, just like if you think of like DevOps being the model where you no longer have a separate operations team and a developer team, similarly combined engineering at Microsoft meant that you no longer had a separate discipline of testing and a separate discipline of engineering. They were now combined into one. And that entire combined team was responsible for not only developing the product, but also ensuring quality. And that, made a bunch of sense to us because as a startup, we were the same way. We didn't have specific roles of testers or developers. It was just one team, and we were building the product. And I think this is a lot of kind of modern applications and agile development teams will work this way in the sense that as you're constantly developing and constantly improving the product, the team works together. And so there are folks that focus more on potentially bug fixing or writing features or helping to validate, a specific customer or a user requirement. But the end result is that you have a single team responsible for the overall quality of that. And, we kind of took it one step further where we integrated support into that team as well. And so, and again, as a startup, that was natural, right, as a small team to have the same team that was building the application running support for it and support, in the early days at Acompli was one of the primary ways we got feature feedback and, bug feedback around the product and helped us kind of at some level, shape the roadmap. And we still do that today at Outlook. And so inside of Microsoft, there's a very rich community of kind of beta testers and users at various levels that help us make sure that we're putting the right effort on the right things, whether it's, correcting bugs or adding additional features or, how do those features evolve. And this talk is the speed of mobile, right? Everybody knows that today, the devices are incredibly pervasive and everybody has a mobile phone generally. And so because of that, the speed at which we would develop software is no longer like, you think of the traditional Microsoft process, from decades ago where they would, build software and spend 3 years, 2 years building it, a year getting it stable, and then they would send it off to Best Buy or the local IT shop or Fry's where you would buy your computer with the software pre-installed. And if you had a problem, Microsoft wasn't really incented to go talk to you. They really wanted you to go back where you, the OEM that you bought it from, you call, Dell or call Compaq or call Best Buy and work with them. Where today in the mobile world, users expect a much rapid turnaround. They expect fixes to happen in, minutes or hours in some cases, and the App Store obviously allows you to update your app, that frequently as well. And so, kind of that shift was a natural one for us.
Awesome, thank you. And so my next question from here would be that, like, what I really loved about your team is you're so constantly pushing the app to production, like on a weekly or bi-weekly basis, and it's really incredible. And you brought in that kind of mindset from Comply to Microsoft. Like, how was that shift for you, and what did it mean for the team when you had to scale your team from 40 to more than 100 people? Like, how was that change for you?
Yeah, it's good, right? I think again, as a startup, we played with different kind of durations of the agile sprint, right? And so in the early days, it was kind of every day or every hour as one new thing was working, we were taking a look at it. And then we tried 2 weeks and realized that a bulk of the work was done on the second Thursday, right? So everybody would kind of sprint towards the end to kind of get their work done on Friday. And we moved to weekly sprints where, then every Thursday people were kind of hustling to get their work done by Friday. And that just was a natural breaking point. And it ended up increasing stability in the sense that you only had 4 to 5 days to kind of make a mistake or introduce change into the product. And generally, if something was found as we were testing on the weekend, you really only had 3 to 5 days of change to go over and look and figure out what went wrong. And similarly, on Mondays before we would push to production, we would take a look at the things that broke and either make a quick fix or roll back in the sense. But the notion of kind of making that shift as we came into Microsoft, again, as a startup, it was straightforward because we were already doing it. And so for mobile, I think the bigger shift is the Mac team came under our broader organization. The Mac team had kind of evolved from shipping in the traditional sense of, doing, every couple year releases, and they had just recently kind of evolved to what was like every other month. They would build something and they would release every month, but they were really releasing last month's software. And we really only made 2 changes and said, hey, let's just ship every week. And then once we get to that point, it radically reduced the number of patches. We never had to do hot fixes and patch the production code because now that we're shipping every week, the next fix is really only a week away. And so the nice thing about being on a model like that, as the train model, is, hey, as the Agile train leaves, it's okay if your work's not done or of high quality by the end of the week. You just wait and put it in the next week. And that burden of trying to rush in features versus a traditional sense where, like, hey, if you miss the 1 month build, it's going to be another month or 2 until your work gets done. And so for us, the transition wasn't too bad, and it was really just a matter of how do we scale it, right? As you said, like, the team grew from when we were acquired, we were a little bit less than 20, and now we're over 100. And so working with that many developers, some of the processes changed, but in many cases, the approach is still the same, right? And so the amount of change that's landing in a given week is much greater now, but still the goal is still the same. Engineers are responsible for the quality of their work and to make sure that what they land on in a given week is quality enough that it can ship to production in a few days.
Yeah, I really love the mindset about Microsoft, and I think all the technology companies are moving in that direction, that like quality is like everyone's responsibility, right? And even when I started testlio, like one of the first things for me, what I noticed in different crowdsourced testing platforms was that like every time when there was an issue in production, then testers were the ones that were looked at or pointed fingers at, that it's like your fault that you didn't catch this, right? But in the end, it's everyone's responsibility. Like if something doesn't go the way it should be, like we should also figure out like how did this problem happen and how can we make sure it doesn't happen again, right? So therefore, like my next question would be actually about prioritization. Like as you said, you're always on the train with the Outlook product, right? And you're releasing on a weekly basis, but there are always going to be issues out there, and you can never fix all of the issues because there can't be any bug-free products out there. So how do you prioritize and like your bug fixes and the next features that you want to release?
Yeah, it's great. It's a good question. So the prioritization is key. And I mean, if you think of, again, I always like to kind of point back to the way we did this with a startup was natural, right? You had a limited amount of funding and you knew the date and time, so many months ahead of time when you would be out of money and the company would fail, right? And if you didn't raise more money or, find customers. And so the inside of Microsoft, the challenge for resources is a little different. but you're not expecting your paychecks to stop or the company to go out of business in a matter of months where you were as a startup. But a lot of that kind of discipline that we learned as a small company has been super helpful, continuing to be rational about the way we make decisions around priority inside of the Outlook team here in Microsoft. And part of that is, you've always got this constant tension of like, do we fix bugs or do we add features? And, at what point is the feature good enough to release? And it is software, so it's almost by definition somewhat imperfect, and there's always ways to make it better. So even when it's great, you can make it faster, and even when it works for a huge number of cases, there's edge cases where under a certain circumstance it doesn't work the way you would desire. And so our prioritization is kind of multifaceted. Like, one is that we take a huge feedback from the community in a qualitative sense, and we get verbatim feedback via our support channels or via our feature voting, that people can go into the app and vote for features that they want to come up. But we also have a very kind of quantitative approach where we look at telemetry, right? We look at things like the number of engaged senders, the amount of errors, the crash rates, and things that we can tell that we know over time, like, hey, that our target is 99.9% crash-free sessions, right? And so you want to always make sure that each iteration of the build actually gets better, right? Is it producing less support interactions? Is it producing a lower number of crashes? Is it continuing to see the right results around the positive aspects, right? The number of events created, the number of emails sent, the number of email items triaged, right? And so if you release a feature or a new build and you notice that one of these kind of key metrics has dropped off in the wrong direction, then it's a point where you can basically say, hey, take a pause and either roll that back and do some investigation before you get too far along. And so prioritization comes from a multitude of ways. And then inside of a big company like Microsoft, obviously there's large enterprise asks and bigger strategic things that we're doing as a company that kind of factor into that as well.
Yeah, and by the end of the day, there's like no happy path to success, or like one equation that will always make like millions of your customers like super, super happy. There are always going to be like some people that are more vocal and like sharing their feedback and not being happy, but by the end of the day, like this is part of like the business. And what I really like about you, Kevin, is like you're always on the trainer. You're always knowing about the latest changes and how to be agile and how to do things really fast. And I think it's really coming from the mindset that you had with your different startups as well. And just for the audience as well, it's there's a funny story that we actually have a poster up in our offices, and we're not the only ones actually. So we have an office and the poster says, what would Kevin do? And every time when we have to make a fast decision, we think about, okay, what would Kevin do? Like Kevin would come up with the solutions where he puts his engineering team to, for example, read support the emails so they would understand like the frustrations of the users as well, and so they would think about the quality, right? So I really, really admire that, Kevin. You're truly awesome. But my next question would be, so what would you consider like the 2 or 3 like biggest challenges that you face like in the short term and on the long term, considering that there are so many like aspects that can actually make the app successful?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And I think, you talk about like the vocal voices and, at an app like this where there's millions and, millions of users using it and millions of new users coming on every week and it's growing at this rate, you just, trying to please the entire crowd is very hard, right? And so then it's, kind of a strategic but also imperative decision to figure out, what is the right set of users to please and what's the goal, right? And so I think there's, from a tactical thing, it's driving the kind of the low-level metrics to say, hey, what are we going to change and what are we going to do? But some of the larger things you need to step back and kind of have a more thoughtful approach to deciding when you want to make a change, right? And so, the user will never come back to you and maybe tell you that they want a certain feature to work a certain way, or they will never come back and say, hey, we really want, our flight and hotel reservations to automatically be added, or change the message list so that now that when you can obviously accept and decline a calendar event, but just make it one tap so when my flight is ready for check-in, there's a check-in button right there, or track the package, right, when Amazon's going to deliver a package to me. And so users generally don't ask for those kind of delighters, and so a lot of that is looking at the strategic assets Microsoft has internally, and how can we leverage that to build a better user experience, right? And one of the cool things we used to do from a strategic point of view as a small company, we still do this today, is that you think of what are the main actions that a user has, right? And our average session in Outlook on mobile is around 20 to 25 seconds, right? And so you have to imagine that this attention that you have from a mobile user when the app is on the screen is going to be just a small number of seconds. They're going to go in and do a few items and look something up in their calendar, or triage a couple mails, or type out a quick response, or just read something really quickly and move on. So how can you make that time super effective for the user and get them back to doing what they want to go on, right? You think of, there's different classes of apps. Like Outlook is an app that, when done right, it should be giving time back to the user, right? It should make it easier. So it should, we look at like, how do you remove taps? Like, how do you save me from tapping or scrolling to add a file, or to send to a new calendar event, or to reply to an email quickly, right? Where you look at apps that are more of social in nature, like Facebook. Like Facebook's goal is not actually to save you time, it's they want you to use up more of your time. They want you to never ever leave the Facebook app, just keep scrolling and scrolling and scrolling, right? And so there's apps that kind of help you waste time, or help you, kind of become more immersed in like the content. And then, where their goal is clearly around, how do they keep you addicted to the next thing? So they show you some really great pictures up front and move on. Where an app like Outlook is, we want to get you the information you need so that you can get back to doing something else, whatever that is in your particular use case.
Thanks a lot. So we actually now have a poll to be pulled up. So the question that we have is, what's the biggest challenge of testing on mobile? And I think I would love to send that question towards you, Kevin, as you briefly already touched a couple of the points. But like, what do you think, what are the biggest challenges of testing on mobile for you, especially on the Outlook team?
Yeah, it's great. I mean, there's a bunch of good answers in there, right? In terms of, those four. Moving quickly and getting great reports is important. I think, we have some great real-time telemetry, but I think always understanding the nuances of specific cases, because, is important. Resources is, you can always, it's not really lack of resources. We have lots of resources. The question is, are you allocating them correctly, right? And I think the natural way, and you mentioned earlier how we changed the model and as a startup to take support tickets inside of engineering, and the goal for that was that, if support was getting overrun and a traditional support org was just kind of acting as a Band-Aid, that would actually hide the problem from engineering. Whereas if that support traffic was coming in, some of the advances that we've had inside of the engineering team actually, in many cases, just to go build better tools, right? And so it's really about that, letting the team decide what are the right resources kind of on the ground with what they're seeing. Bugs across devices is kind of classic, and that's a really, really tough one, especially on Android, where the diversity of OS and diversity of device combinations and the diversity of the power of those devices varies greatly. Whereas on the iOS side, once it kind of works on iOS, it generally works pretty consistently across the various devices. And generally, we see that the OS updates are in a much narrower band than they would be on Android. And then figuring out device coverage, kind of the last one there is something, we look at pretty regularly. Like we definitely have, there's classes of devices where we see more crashes, especially in the low memory ones, in certain regions of the world where they're a little more challenging. But a lot of that is, again, kind of pulled out of telemetry of where are we seeing the problems. And then on a given week, which ones are the most tricky ones to kind of get. And in some cases, the place that testlio helps us, right, is that, we have a relatively distributed team in 5 offices across the world for the Outlook mobile team, but there's areas where we don't have coverage, right, where we just don't have the right network to produce it, or we don't have the right, version of a device. And so, leveraging some of the device and human power that testlio gives us is a huge advantage in terms of being able to get the device coverage, but then be able to also find a way to reproduce those on a set of devices that we might not have readable access to.
Yeah, and I think the one thing is that.
But I'm curious.
We
should pull up the results and see what the audience thinks, right? So I have my opinion. But.
Yep, I'm actually pulling them in shortly, but I just wanted to ask one question before we're waiting for the last results. it was due to, like, as you mentioned, like the Android fragmentation is just huge, right? Like there are tens of thousands of Android devices on the market. Like, how do you, like, what's your decision on prioritization? Like, how do you decide, okay, like we need to test on these devices, and like testlio has to help us with doing that, for example?
Yeah, we have a couple answers, right? I mean, so, at Microsoft, we obviously serve, a wide range of users, and a global audience at that. And so we kind of look at it in two piles. Like one is like our consumer use space. Like what is it that the consumers, where is the kind of popular consumer devices? And, everybody in the world doesn't run on the latest Pixel phone or the latest, Samsung S8. And generally the apps work really well on those, right? They're very high power, multi-core devices with lots of RAM and great screens and all kinds of good stuff. And so, and many times like developers and a lot of the people inside the company have those new devices. And so there's a constant tear to like use the latest. But, personally, I use a Samsung S5 as my Android device, right? And so I run a device that at its time, right, 3 years ago, when we were building Acompli, was a top tier device. And today it's a great humbling experience to use that kind of device. And many large apps don't actually work. Like if you use Waze, which is this popular GPS app, and Uber, like I can't run them both at the same time on that device really well, right? I have to literally kill one to use the other one, which is good because generally if I'm riding in an Uber or a Lyft, I'm not driving, so I don't need Waze. But it's something that, it's helped us really find issues. And, kind of me using a lower end device as my primary device on Android really helps, help reset and find some things that, especially for the volume of email that I get, find some issues that just aren't apparent on the latest devices, even devices that are 1 or 2 years old. And so, we have a mix of those and, device libraries inside the company that people can have leverage to. But in the case where we find issues with certain sets of those, then, we leverage testlio obviously to help us.
Awesome. So we're ready to see the results. And the results are like this. So 56% of the audience thought that reproducing bugs across the devices is the biggest challenge. Then 22% thought that testing or reporting speed. 14 was prioritization on device coverage, and 8 was lack of resources. So how do you think about that? Like reproducing bugs across devices was the biggest hurdle for the audience.
Yeah, makes sense.
Awesome. All right, let's jump over to our next slide, which is the state of mobile, and the key challenges is really how do we deliver in good quality, do it on high scale and very fast speed, right? So how do we really optimize and be optimal in this process, because we can do every task forever. So how do you think that organizations can overcome this hurdle?
Yeah, it's a good set of questions. I think they're all obviously related. And the example I'll use is kind of the way that we transformed the Mac Outlook team, right? Which again was building for Apple, but it's mirrored off the model that we had for mobile. Is you really can, if you think of like at the very high level, you make two changes, right? One is that you find a way to deliver to real end customers every week, right? And whether that's your live customers in full production, or it's some subset of beta or test customers that you want to have early access to, having a way to get constant feedback and ensure that not only the team, in our case, every build goes to all of the developer devices and kind of the what we say friends of the developer team, so product managers, folks, designers, and things like that, basically every few minutes. And so if you check in a change today into our development branch for the Android or the iOS app, the build kicks off automatically, runs some automation tests, and via Hockey app basically pushes that change down to the devices in a few minutes. And so, throughout a day on a high frequency day, you're getting 4, 5, 6 updates a day, and some of those have multiple changes in them because it batches them. But you're getting a frequent update, and so that's the first step is, are your developers and kind of friends of the development team actually using the app and seeing those changes come in live? Like, that's great. And for an app like email, it makes it easy because people are using it as their production app. Some apps, maybe they aren't as, kind of used in everyday life for the developers and the QA folks or the designers may not be using this app, but having it a way that it's very seamless for any check-in to automatically make it down to all the devices that care is important, and then shipping that to some kind of beta or external community that doesn't have the dev team on speed dial is a great forcing function to get that quick feedback, and then being able to get those once you're confident that that release is good out to production as quick as possible, right? We think of this, you really want to remove the amount of kind of code, code that's stored, right? So code that's basically written but not shipped, right? And so we think of that as code debt at some level, right? Is that, hey, you've written this code, but it hasn't actually got out to production. It's not actually real. And so we really try to keep the amount of kind of parked or idle code that's been written but not released to a minimum, and shipping, weekly is one of the great ways to do that. And then in terms of the, scale, is that as you get larger user bases, you need to be a little more careful, right? And so with Android, it's great. You can roll out in percentage updates, and with iOS 11, we're going to get that same functionality on iOS, where we can roll out in small updates. To have a user base with, millions and millions of users, you really want to be a little more careful, and you have the, the responsibility of being more careful, so that you're what we call a safe velocity, right? So what's the speed that you can move at where you're still not harming people? Because if we would ship a bad build where every Outlook in the world would crash, we would literally grind some of the users and some of our enterprises to a halt if we took out their ability to do mobile email.
Thanks a lot. So when we dig deeper into the speed issue, I think you've done a phenomenal job in terms of releasing very fast and being very persistent on your release cycle, so your customers can really expect that, okay, like if I have this issue this week, I know Kevin is going to take care of fixing it for the next one, right? So in terms of like the speed, like we know that if we release too fast, we can really risk on poor quality, but if we release too slow, we can risk losing out to customers. So how do you like really balance the trade-off between speed and quality?
Yeah, and I think it ends up, like I said, if you can set up the process, you really don't want to have to, micromanage a team, right? You really want to set the team up for success where they can make this trade-off on their own, right? And so, we've made some mistakes along the way in terms of moving too fast or pushing too much change, but you don't want to like set up a really rigid policy where like, oh, any change over the 112 lines can't be pushed out in a week or needs this much testing or this much time to bake. Like, we really want that decision to be incredibly local and to be distributed down to the team that's doing the work. And so, the way I've set the team up, or the way I think through it, is that, hey, we want, the thing that I want to enforce is that we ship every week. Like, Fridays are like religion or church, and every week you ship a build, and we ship it to test over the weekend, and then on Monday we ship to production, and you want that to be religion and not to be broken. Yet you want the packets of that to be fungible, right? And so you don't want a PM or project manager driving that it must make this or that release, right? You really want quality to be built into that process. And the way that works is that engineers need to have their own confidence level on like, hey, how good is this code? How confident am I that if it gets out to production, I have a way to turn it off? Like, we feature flag everything so that we can, as much as possible, so that if we roll something out and it doesn't work out or it finds a surprise issue, we're able to disable it dynamically in the field without having to ship a new release. So those are some of the tricks that we use to basically, allow us to have an incredibly high velocity with still a pretty high level of safety in the quality of what we've actually released.
So you mentioned that you've had some challenges in terms of like releasing too fast as well. Like, can you dig deeper a bit, like dig a bit deeper on this topic as well? Like, what were some of the challenges that you faced, or how fast did you release then when you faced those issues?
Yes, I mean, been doing software a long time. We've made every mistake, right? We've shipped databases that freeze up and don't migrate. We've shipped crashers on launch, and so we've done all of the bad things, but we try to learn from those, right? So we try to put in protections and either a testing or an approach with feature flags so that we're safer kind of the next time we learn from those mistakes. So we've done, we've made just about every mistake you can imagine. We've changed UI and, forgot to put in really base cases, so like reply doesn't work or forward or something really core to that. And so today we have a mix of, kind of lightweight checks that we go through. Obviously, pushing every change to the development team and friends of the development team allows us to see things that are broken or don't look right very quickly. And then we do a sanity check on Fridays as we ship to our kind of testing branch. testlio makes a pass over with a set of smoke tests. And so I kind of think of that as the don't get fired list. And so if you're shipping an email app, things that like reply, forward, create a calendar event, et cetera, you can't, if we ship those out to production at any size, even a small 1% type ring, like we should kind of be fired for that, right? And so testlio helps us by validating those very basic smoke tests on real live devices from around the world with a variety of OSs and a variety of combinations, because again, like, even in our, best guess of the world, we can't hit every combination. And even then it's really just a prioritization of hitting the ones that we, that we think, how do we be most defensive against the matrix, right? Nobody can test every combination every time. But we have a pretty good list of the ones that, we test on a set of low memory devices, right? So some of the Motorola devices are really challenging with low memory on the older generation of phones. And we test with, variety of some of the, we always test with the lowest, Android OS version and iOS version that we support to make sure that, hey, it still works, even though, we may have moved to some of the newer APIs and some of the new devices, but the old devices still work. And so kind of think of it as kind of catching the corners of that matrix to prevent us from shipping things that are just, kind of dead on arrival.
Thanks. Yeah, like I think manual testing has a huge benefit, and in case of Outlook as well, where you want to release fast and you want to test on real devices on different locations, like this is the way to go. But you briefly mentioned the automation perspective as well at Outlook. So how does automation fit in your team at this point?
Yes, I mean, UI automation is really tricky, and I think, if you look back 10 years ago, web automation was in this same world where there's a lot of frameworks and lots of great ideas, but in practice, for the most complex apps, it's still pretty nascent. And I always think of it as, unless there's a positive ROI, you really don't want to do it. And so for our team, we have, I would say, reasonable, not great coverage on some of the lower level things, so things that aren't UI. We have almost no UI automation. Simply because the amount of change in the UI, we just found that there wasn't a positive ROI. So the return on having people write and maintain those tests is low. And one of the tests I always, had when we first started the team, we actually hired some folks even at Acompli to write automation, was, can you write, automate the smoke test, right? So automate the most basic set of things that we want to ship every week to guarantee that they work. And then as long as you can get that working for 4 consistent releases without no changes to the tests, right? So the tests pass and they work without having broken tests or test server timing out or device farm not booting or whatever, then we can go invest in a larger kind of automation team. And here we are 4 years later, and we still don't have a set of test tools that can do that, right? And so, so we personally, in the way we do it, we stay away from UI automation. We don't do it. Now, if your app is simple and it doesn't have a lot of complexity in forms or velocity of change, and most of the changes below the surface, then I think, go for it. But I always think about it as, are you better off spending that time writing automation, and, and are your testers writing automation that's new and adding coverage, or are they just spending time kind of maintaining the test harnesses and all of the frameworks and pieces that are involved in it? And from what we've found, the return on investment is just not there for building UI automation. But clearly on the server and on the kind of what I would say the non-UI parts of the code, activity, database work, migrations and things like that, we're able to build automation that is stable enough that it's trustworthy. And we really focus on, I would say, unit testing versus what you would call kind of integration testing with testing up a live kind of system running. It's more unit tests at a lower level of the code where we can be sure that they will pass to a point that the investment makes sense.
Awesome. Yeah, I totally agree with your points in terms of automation as well. And like when I look at the other customers that we've been working with, and they're really huge brands, and they like have to move fast to be on this competitive market. Like they've found out as well that the return on investment on UI automation is just really, it's non-existent basically. And as you mentioned as well, like there are so many incredible tools that help you like run the scripts on like so many different devices, but one of the challenges that you're going to run into is really maintaining the test cases instead of like writing new scripts, right? So, yeah, I have to agree with you on this point as well. Yeah, moving forward, I would love to learn more a little bit about, I would actually love the audience to learn from you, because I already know everything. But how do you really measure success, and how do you measure your teams and QA success in your organization? And yeah, that's my question. Let's start from there.
Sure. So I think, the list of things you got up here, right? App reviews, user feedback, beta testing, I think those are all good. I think, the larger sentiment in the market is, hey, do people use your app, and is your app growing, right? And, some really core things around retention, right? Is retention good? And that was one of the early indicators that we saw when we were building Acompli, is that we had a step function of retention higher than the average productivity apps inside of the App Store, right? And you can compare them against your category, right? And sure, there's lots of places where you can figure out what the retention is or what the usage is of the category of your apps. And so, being able to kind of understand that from a high level and saying, hey, is the app serving its purpose? Are your customers happy with it? I think is a base case. But clearly we look at the app reviews, and, we used to always have this, kind of mantra, 5-star app shipped every 7 days on both platforms, right? Was kind of our thing. And, when we were a startup, we had the 5-star app, and we were able to move, in this kind of 7-day cycle. We still move at the 7-day cycle on both platforms. And now we've added Mac to the team as well. 5-star app's a little harder to get. The shoes of Outlook are pretty large to fill, and so we're eking on the 4 plus 5 stars, kind of like bouncing right between 4.5 and 5 these days. But it's tough, right? It's a lot harder, right? Because we have a 30-year head start in terms of what people expect for Outlook on their phone, and so there's lots of things that we can go fill. But we look at that. We listen to users. There's some tools we use to let users vote. In-app support is incredible for us, and being able to, take those support tickets directly and basically talk to users from the app has been a huge way of getting kind of anecdotal feedback. Beta testing, it says here, I think the other one would be telemetry, right? We have a ton of telemetry around some of the key things that we know are important around performance, and some of the metrics that we expect, users on the key things that are very important in our app. Like, we know that once you've connected, your second email account, because a lot of professionals today have 2 email addresses at least, right? They have one for work and one for home. And like, once you've connected both of those, the chance of you sticking with our app is twice the amount that if you would have just connected like just a consumer account or just a work account, right? And so things like that we look for, and we try to make sure that we have the onboarding easy enough so that people can add a couple accounts and set that up correctly right away and get the most from the application.
Awesome. Super awesome. And yeah, like talking about the measuring success as well. And I think that's one of the strategies that a lot of the other companies that we work with have applied as well. Like in case of one of our customers, Lyft, for example, they have a huge beta testing community. They have like 3,000 like drivers and people who drive the car, and basically they get tons of feedback from there, but at the same time they utilize like manual internal QA and then all the other different types of testing. So it's really important.
Awesome.
And next I would actually like to pull up another poll. Let's do it. So I would like to ask the audience as well, how do they measure QA's impact on the customer experience? How would you answer that question, Kevin?
So I mean, like I said, I always think of QA as the, the role of the entire team, right? And so, so I would just think like, how is the product, or what's the key goal that you're looking for, that that the user is happy, right? And I think, sustained usage is always the easiest one, right? And so I think, the business goals or, growth around that is probably really key. But clearly listening to users, right, is also, critical, right? I mean, this user feedback, and I think of user feedback both as what they're saying negatively in a support channel when something's not working, or positively on Twitter or on some social network to promote this app to their friends, right? We also look at the NPS score, so we, periodically prompt users inside the app to, ask the basic, would you recommend this app to a friend, right? And that's a tough one, guys, because I think for an email app, it's like, well, I don't really talk about email apps with my friends, right? But you can baseline it against what you know around other apps inside of our company or around even, other competitor apps in the store, right? And so user feedback, I think if I had to pick one, is probably the goal there is, you really, you're building this app to serve users, right? And so the business goals are nice, but if the users are unhappy, the business goals are going to be a trailing metric, right? I think the leading metric there is how, users are very quick, especially in today's day and age. If you provide them an easy way to give feedback, they will give it to you, and it's super valuable. And so I think part of that is, providing yourself a way to get feedback. I know a lot of large apps at our scale, consumer apps, don't have great ways to contact support, right? Because it's expensive to talk to customers. But, we think of it as like, support is kind of a feature, and getting user feedback is something that is critical for us to drive our roadmap.
Yeah, I gotta agree with you on here. But considering you have like so much experience, like 20 years and more, like how much has this QA measurement thing like shifted over the past decade, for example, for you? Like, have you, like, I think there are still companies out there that track QA success based on the number of issues that they report, for example. So I know many organizations, even in Estonia, that do or track their QA success based on that. Like, how do you think about that? And have you ever had
I was
that
a
kind of
huge
mindset?
fan. Yeah, huge fan back in the day of bug counts and bug zero and all kinds of crazy stuff like that. And we just spreadsheets after spreadsheets of different pivots of the bug table and where we're at and trying to burn down the list. And we don't really look at it anymore, right? I mean, we think of, we clearly use it for sprint planning, and we obviously have bug databases and things of that, but they're really, places to be, they're more collaborative, right? In terms of like, how do we work with, the team that's doing device testing or the team that's building it or the product managers to have a conversation piece where we can store some of those conversations. But I think of it less as like a death march of like saying, hey, we have to drive all the XYZ bugs out of a product, right? It's really more of like, hey, how do you break up the sprint and what's next, right? It's really a prioritization model in terms of how you do that. And, I mean, even with testlio, right, we let, when you guys test, we say, hey, you just give us your 3 best bugs, right? Because obviously, any app, I can pick up any app and find lots of bugs, right? And so the question is, what's the high priority bugs and what are the ones we really should be looking at that we should fix this week, right? Because I think everything else is noise. It's like if a bug's not scheduled to be fixed for a month, more than likely in the next few weeks, that view of the world will change, right? There will be something more important or something more urgent. And if that thing ends up being the most urgent thing a month from now, then great, we'll fix it. But spending a lot of time planning and thinking through which bug you're going to fix 4 weeks from now, I think is a waste of energy, right? And so we really focus on, it was a refreshing thing and simplistic way of dealing with a lot of teams inside of Microsoft as we came in as a startup, and they would say, hey, we got this great new idea or this great new feature or this SDK, and we want you to integrate something. And I was like, great, can you send it over to me and we'll ship it on Friday? And like, whoa, I mean, it was like basically being punched in the face because they were like, holy moly, like you are ready to just ship it. And they're like, no, we're still going to plan it and we're thinking through it. I'm like, well, great, when you're done with all that work and you're ready to go, just give it to us and we'll ship it Friday. And so this notion of switching your model to, thinking about what's going to be built for Friday really helps focus the team on what's important, right? And it takes away a lot of this squishiness in terms of lots of planning and forward thinking, because at the speed that apps and the market moves today, you really don't want to be planning so far ahead for the details. Clearly bigger strategic things, make sense, but really, it's about what are you doing this week and how is that going to move the product forward against your goals, right? And you're tracking against those goals.
Awesome. And we actually have the feedback in as well. And drum roll, user feedback is really having the biggest impact on customer experience, like from QA's perspective. And I think it's great way to move forward. And as we spoke about the more like older strategies as well, where we track QA's performance based on the number of issues, it doesn't really matter anymore. Like what we really care about is making our customers happy, and that's all that matters. And then we actually had 0% of the audience answered app ratings. Interesting. How would you comment that?
I mean, I don't know. If I had a one-star app, I'd be pretty embarrassed, and I'd be, I think we'd be failing, right? And so I think,
Yeah.
I agree that you may not be the QA may not be responsible for app ratings, but I mean, at some level they are. I mean, somebody's responsible for the app ratings, right? And it's like if you built the wrong app, I don't know. I think it's important. Clearly, it's a lagging indicator. It's probably not the first thing you're going to see, but at the end of the day, like, that is a user feedback channel, right? And so I think user feedback is a broader way of looking at it, but clearly app ratings are user feedback. And so I could argue that the questions are a little bit slighted from that sense, that, app ratings are a user feedback. And in some level, app rating is the most public user feedback. Because when somebody tells me something in support or on Twitter, or even, via, a direct message type thing, it may not be public to everybody. And even though Twitter is public, it's not as public as the app ratings, which every single user will see who's going to go get your app, right? Who's going to be the new person to download the app. The first thing they'll see is the app rating. They may not go and search Twitter or search some forum to look for the answer. So I think app ratings are important, especially for growth marketing, right? Nobody is excited to go download a one-star app. You're like, I kind of have to use this because it integrates with something I need. But when given choice and in markets where they're competitive, I think the app, having a strong app rating is incredibly important. And we spend a lot of time, looking through that.
Awesome. Kevin, like seriously, I would love to talk to you about this specific topic forever. Hopefully I have this opportunity when you're flying to Estonia next week, but yeah, we're gonna start wrapping up. So the last topic that I wanted to briefly cover as well is the future of testing. So, and I think at this topic we have a lot of questions in terms of like automation versus manual, and what can I automate, what can't I, and is exploratory testing and manual testing here to stay? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, so we talked a little bit about automation. I think there's some value in manual testing as long as it's focused on something that's important, right? Like, what are the key things you don't want to break? I think is a great place to validate, device specifically, kind of validating the device matrix. Automation testing, again, are you getting an ROI? So it really depends on the app and what framework and tools, and I think that's different for everybody, but really should look at what's the investment that you're putting in to build that, and that's the best way to spend that time. Exploratory testing, I think of as users, right? And I always, you don't get to choose your users in this world, right? The mobile users you don't know who has a phone or who's going to go get your app on a given day, and you don't know what persona or why they're going to get your app. And so in many cases, you don't have a choice, right? And so because of that, I think exploratory testing is incredibly valuable. And not only that, like testing with users that haven't had a lot of experience with your device. And I remember when we first started, working with Tesla, they were like, oh, can you give us the test list or what you want us to test? And I was like, no, like I want you to pick up the phone that's in your pocket, go download our app and try to break it, right? And so that's it. Any coaching feels like cheating, right? Because I can tell you the things that I think are going to break, but that's not, I don't get to do that with our users. And so it's a great way to, I think exploratory testing is a great way to kind of probe what's out there, right? And you don't have any kind of protection of, once your app is kind of shipped to live, it's in the App Store and anybody can go get it and they can do the wrong things with it. And unlike kind of a traditional software package where maybe you can choose your customers or it's driven to a certain customer segment, the App Store has kind of taken that away, and in a good way, right? Everybody has access to these apps, especially free apps. And so, yeah, you need to be prepared to kind of deal with that, with whatever comes, and not have a bunch of onboarding or training or, what's the training required? There should be none. It should be like, you should just be a phone user, which most people are these days. So pick up the phone and go use it. And if you can't figure it out, we did something wrong. We didn't make the app obvious enough or easy enough to use.
Yeah, I love your insights in terms of the exploratory testing. And whenever I talk about testing, then I talk about testing as a learning and exploration process of like really learning about the product and trying to understand the user's perspective and then making prioritizations based on that, right? And so that's where testers have a lot of power and insights into the product's development process. So yeah, I have to agree with you that I personally don't think that we can replace manual QA in the next like decade or so. But I think we'd like to move on to audience questions now, and I'm going to ask Josiah to jump in here and ask questions from you, Kevin.
Cool,
Yay.
let's do
All
it.
right. Perfect. All right. Before we start Q&A, remember you can ask Crystal and Kevin questions by typing them in the field beneath the panels and by clicking the submit button. We'll try to get through as many questions as possible right now, but for any questions we're unable to answer during the live Q&A, some will be answered offline. Let's start right over here with this one. This person wants to know, do you use a beta platform, and have you had success in collecting and analyzing beta data? Also on that, how do you decide which clients will participate in the beta test, and do you reward them?
So we use Hockey App as our beta testing platform for Android because there's no limitations around that. For iOS, we have to use TestLite, which does limit the number of users. And so in that case, we try to split up the users. And if users aren't downloading the app every week, we basically remove them from the program because we have a limited set of users. The rewards, we don't have any rewards today. It's really just, people that like to test and want to have the early access to those features. So in some level, they're being rewarded by getting a sneak peek into what we're doing next, but there's no explicit reward that we give out today.
All right, thanks so much. So this person wants to know, what is the ideal percentage of automation versus manual testing?
Yeah, I think it's really app specific. I mean, it's a great question, but I think it's really, ideally automation's always better, right? Things that are automatic sound better than doing things manually, but you need to make sure that when you're spending that time building automation that it's an ROI positive event, so that investment is positive, right? In the sense that if you're spending, 3 people or 3 engineers building and fixing automation every week versus, having them spend 3 or 4 hours at the end of the shift or at the end of the week to go and just do those tests manually, they'd probably be better off just manually validating those and looking for a partner if you don't have the right devices to kind of do that yourself.
All right, thanks so much. And you did touch on it a little bit earlier, Kevin, about QA at Microsoft, but this person just wanted to know a little bit more about it and is asking, how did your approach to QA change after you joined Microsoft?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is that we had to be a lot more careful, right? Like, when at the size of the user base today, even a fraction of 1% is millions of users, and that's, we have kind of we have to take care of those users and make sure that we don't do something wrong. And so I think we just had to be more careful, and as part of that, the team's culture around pushing risky change and being able to disable things and watch metrics closely, became something more of a key aspect.
All right, and this is also something you have experience in. This person wanted to know, what kind of hurdles should QA teams anticipate as they scale with their organization?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, if I could design a new QA, I would, again, I think the merged idea of merging QA and developer into one team is a great, this combined engineering is just a stronger way to approach things. I know a lot of traditional companies probably have that's the way I was building teams traditionally. Even 3 years ago, I had a separate QA and a dev team. And so I think, combining them makes it easy because they scale together, right? An engineer is an engineer, and if you add an engineer, you're adding them to the combined team. Not necessarily dedicating them to test or development, and what they do on a given day is really driven by the priorities of the app and the business and less of what hat they're wearing.
All right, and we have just about time for one more question. You touched on this a little bit beforehand, but someone else just wanted a little bit of clarification. They want to know, what will QA look like in 5 years, and will we be testing APIs instead of apps?
That's a great question. It really depends. I think, there is some APIs that'll be interesting for certain kinds of companies. I mean, companies that have externally facing APIs, obviously that's important to test. But I think for applications, assuming devices still look like they look today, maybe there's VR, AR, some really cool innovative stuff, but I think those will still have applications on them. And so the devices we use will be different, and the methods we use will be different. And if you think that far out, think of yourself automating yourself playing a VR game. Like you got a robot to automate the thing now because there's shakes and moves. And so clearly there's going to be some challenges there in terms of, taking today's automation software and applying it. But I think it'll be a mix of, user feedback, kind of specialists that kind of test with the various devices and end user, and then, some where you can automating it.
All right, perfect. And that will actually end our event for today. I'd like to thank our speakers, Crystal and Kevin, for their time. I'd like to thank testlio for sponsoring this event. Also, a special thank you goes out to you, the audience, for spending the last hour with us. Have a great day, and we hope to see you at a future event.